two, 1, 2, 3.
Hello and welcome to DSA Presents. I'm Deirdre Silverman and my guest today is Zenon Wasyliw, teaches history at Ithaca College and who knows a lot more about Ukraine and the history of the region than most people in this area. So Zenon, I have a couple of questions for you that have just come up for me as I've been listening to the news. In the past, we used to refer to Ukraine as the Ukraine, and that was seen at a certain point, that was a no-no because that implied that it was the Ukrainian part of Russia and that it should just be referred to as Ukraine, an independent country. But lately, I've been hearing more people going back to the Ukraine. I heard Tariq Ali do it last week. So what's the proper way to describe it, to name it?
Well, you were correct in terms of Ukraine. The Ukraine implies a territory, a region. Ukraine offers really a more defined identity and a sovereign state. And did little noises just come through?
No.
Okay. A sovereign state. And I think people just became accustomed because it was always referred to as the Ukraine. And it wasn't until Ukraine gained its independence that it was featured as Ukraine, as again, a state with its own identity rather than kind of a regional identity.
Okay, and when did it gain its independence?
Well, in August of 1991, the Ukrainian parliament declared independence. This was followed by a referendum in December. And in the referendum, over 92% of the population voted for independence. Overwhelming number, of course. And that became the process of starting a government built on an old system and moving in a new direction. And there would be successive elections, the formation of a parliament, different presidential elections, and so forth, and kind of entering the global community.
Okay, and one question that I've had is about the size of Ukraine, how the country was constituted, because it is, aside from Russia, geographically, the largest country in Europe. And we've talked about this before. Parts of what are now Ukraine used to be parts of other countries. My grandmother's family came from what they considered Hungary. They thought of themselves as Hungarians. That's now Ukraine. Parts of Poland that are now Ukraine. How did those borders get set? How did Ukraine get so big?
Well, you're right. Ukraine has a population of 45 million. It's a very large territory. And in the 19th century, you would have the start of a Ukrainian national movement. Interestingly enough, the Ukrainian national movement started in the east of Ukraine at Kharkiv University in Poltava. And so it's important to note that it isn't really Western Ukraine that you have to figure on, but there's a strong legacy there. And very often you would have ethnographers and people looking at what language people spoke And we'll see that despite, I mean, there was really severe repression under the Tsars. The Ukrainian language was banned, etc. But it'll be with the revolutionary period of 1917 through 21, where there was an attempt to have an independent Ukraine. And the borders were based on these ethno-linguistic identities, to the degree that the strength of this national ideal was noticed by Lenin, and despite the failure of the Ukrainian People's Republic forming, the creation of the USSR acknowledged that there is a Ukrainian nation with Ukrainian boundaries. And actually, what Lenin was worried about was the rise of great Russian chauvinism, that there's a tendency towards dictatorship and kind of not acknowledging the multinational character that's in the region. And actually, there were even Ukrainian populations outside of the borders of Ukraine where Ukrainian was even being taught. And in the 1920s, a renaissance, a Ukrainian renaissance, even within Ukraine. Also at this time, you see the breakup of empires in 1918, and it'll be the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And at the time, one section became attached to Hungary, another section became attached to Poland, another section became attached to Romania. And so there was this kind of regional grab that took place, but with further consolidation after the Second World War, the part of Ukraine that was part of Poland became part of Soviet Ukraine, and that border remained. That border remained. And one of the realities that has taken place within contemporary Ukraine is the rise of a civic identity. And with the Euro-Maidan revolution of 2014, well, actually 2013, it appeared that Ukraine was ready to sign an agreement, a European Union association agreement. When this didn't happen, that's when the protests began. And it was really widely supported. And by 2014, we see a transformation of Ukrainian society to a more civic identity. And as it stands now, there's an acknowledgement that Ukraine is really a multinational, multi-ethnic, multi-religious state. And so there are different people of different national backgrounds. And as we can see, the current president, who received over 70% of the vote, is a Russian language speaker of Jewish background. There have been the prime minister who's been Jewish, a president temporary who's of Protestant background. And so it's a real civic identity. And when you look at the autocratic nature of the Putin state, that is fighting against a civic identity, against civic initiatives. And one of the reasons given for the invasion of Ukraine was to liberate Russian speakers, which is absurd, of course. And we see Putin using history to gain or restore a mythical, imagined past, still kind of based on autocracy, orthodoxy, and nationality. When you see Putin, he uses the signs or the symbols of an empire, an autocratic empire, an empire that was the age of all-powerful autocrat, pogroms, suppression of others. It was not following the ideals of Tolstoy. And so with this and with the idea of orthodoxy and interplay with the Russian Orthodox Church, and there's repression of other religious groups in Russia today, and this Russian world coming to the salvation of people who speak Russian. One of the ironies and the realities is Ukraine is a bilingual country. People exchange with both languages. Andrei Kurkov, a famous novelist, is Russian, of Russian ethnicity, but Ukrainian by citizenship. And so after the Euro-Maidan, even the eastern part of Ukraine caught on with this civic identity, civic engagement. What's interesting now is local governments are very strong and also self-reliant. And the Russian invasion has attacked Russian-speaking cities, and they're offering strong resistance. And so you have this delusional use of some mystical imperial past justifying an invasion of a country that has its own identity. It isn't just ethnic, but it's a civic identity as well. And he's killing Russian speakers. So you see the irony in all of this.
Yes, but prior to this, have Russians or Russian-speaking people been in danger or discriminated against in Ukraine since independence or since the revolution?
No, what happened is in the 1920s, Ukrainian was encouraged, but then under the Stalin years, there was a push in Russification. So it was cyclical. Not only that, but the Ukrainian Communist Party of the 1920s became very assertive. And you had a cultural renaissance taking place. And this couldn't occur. And it led even in the 1930s, we're finding out from the archives, the Ukrainian countryside was in rebellion. And eventually this led to a war against the Ukrainian countryside, Ukrainian peasantry, that led to the Holodomor, the famine that took millions and millions of lives. After this repression, we'll see with the death of Stalin, kind of another revival in the 1960s. You know, it's kind of interesting, the 1920s, a renaissance, cultural renaissance. In the 1960s, a revival taking place. At the time, there was a leader called Shellist who wrote a book, Oh, Ukraine, My Ukraine, and the kind of a desire to make decisions within their own republic. That was quickly repressed. And cultural figures were arrested, party members were deposed, people were sent into psychiatric asylums. And beginning in around 1972, there was a decision by the Central Committee of the Communist Party to start shutting down Ukrainian language schools all across Ukraine. And so you had this forced Russification to the degree where many people of an older generation didn't have a chance to study and learn Ukrainian. This was really an attack on anything Ukrainian. With the rise of the Helsinki group, with the Helsinki Accords, you see a push, a support of human rights taking place. Ukrainian activists worked with Jewish activists at the time. You had many arrests taking place. And so it was really, I mean, Leonid Plush, a Marxist mathematician, was really upset. He went to a store and spoke in Ukrainian, and they told him, speak in a human language. Ukrainian is a language to use with animals, kind of inferring, and this is where Lenin said you kind of had this great Russian chauvinism coming to the forefront. But then you had Chernobyl taking place, where we see that the party was hiding things and dysfunctional. With the coming of independence in 1991, you see the reintroduction of the Ukrainian language in schools. And you have an entire younger generation that prefers using Ukrainian now. But people easily are bilingual in terms of public communication. If you went to Kharkiv, if you went, even in the Western Ukrainian cities, they won't complain if you use Russian, but it is an independent Ukrainian state. The current president, Volodymyr Zelensky, is a native Russian speaker from the south of Ukraine, but he uses Ukrainian because that is the state language, but he easily switches over to Russian as well. And again, if you go to Kharkiv, they speak Russian there.
So one of Putin's other claims is that there was a Nazi or neo-Nazi involvement both in 1994 and currently in the Ukrainian government. Can you speak to that?
Sure. I don't understand with 1994 because in reality, that's when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons with the Budapest Memorandum. And the promise which Russia signed on to was to respect the sovereignty and territory of Ukraine, which did not happen. The bigger problem in Ukraine has been corruption. And with corruption, it was reaching a horrible point. And the movement towards change was kind of continuously pushed back. I would say in 2004, you had the Orange Revolution, similar to other colored revolutions. And that was, interestingly enough, influenced by Gene Sharp. I don't know if you ever heard of Gene Sharp of the Einstein Institute. He wrote From Dictatorship to Democracy. And I learned not too long ago that the director of the secret police archives, because in Kiev, they have opened all the archives, translated it. And so 198 ways for peaceful revolution. And it was successful, and you've had successful elections taking place. In 2013, 2014, you had, well, in 2013, when the European Union Association Agreement was not signed, and you have to remember that Yanukovych was very close to Putin. And it was going in the direction that you would have a triumvirate of Putin, Lukashenko, and Yanukovych. And at the time, Yanukovych's advisor was Manafort. In a way, Manafort ended up in jail because of what was discovered with the criminality and corruption of the Yanukovych regime. And so when you had the start, it was an Afghan refugee Ukrainian citizen, Mustafa Naim, and others who were journalists, human rights activists, who used social media to call people to demonstrate. When the demonstration started and the young people were beat up, others joined the demonstration as well. So it was really a cross-section of the Euro-Maidan that took place. Was there a right wing involved in it? Yes, there was. But there were human rights activists, LGBTQ activists, people of different backgrounds, religious groups, civic groups, etc. When the Euro-Maidan ended, we'll see further elections taking place. And interestingly enough, we found out that the Yanukovych regime that was aligned with Putin was actually funding far-right groups. And so when elections have taken place, they've received less than 2% of the vote. The far right even tried to gather together, and they couldn't achieve, out of a parliament of 450, they have no representatives, which is unlike other European states.
Right, and certainly then states that are nearby, like Hungary and Poland.
Yes.
And what about CIA involvement? I mean, we don't really know what the CIA is involved in, but to the extent that we do, have they been involved?
I'm tired of this West planing. I mean, this is a great term, West planing, only looking from the perspective of the West. Ukrainians have agency. Ukrainians are people. Ukrainians are Christian, Jewish, Muslim, of Hungarian background, of Polish background, a variety of backgrounds. They did not like corruption. That's what they were fighting against. When you have Nuland there, she doesn't know what's going on. Yes, you go, oh, maybe get this person or whatever. But we're people. And there was corruption. And when Yanukovych fled and voted out also with the parliament, they went into his mansion and they discovered all of the documents they tried to get rid of. Actually, historians, archivists, and scuba divers went in and gathered all the evidence where he and his cronies were using state funds to enrich themselves in the billions and billions of dollars. Similar to what's happening in Russia. Putin's the richest man in the world, they say. He has a second family in Switzerland. Look at all of these oligarchs, tons and tons of money. Where did they get the money? They stole it. They stole it. Just like oligarchs, I'm sorry, I'm being a little radical, just like oligarchs around the world, even in the US. Why should people not pay taxes, etc.? And so in Ukraine, the Euro-Maidan revolution was a push for, among the first things that happened was any candidate running for office had to release all of their financial statements. If you recall, we had a presidential candidate not too long ago who didn't release this. And it's really now you have young people in charge. You can look at Zelensky's team among others. And so there is this pressure from below. There is a de-oligarchization push in the parliament taking place as well. It's been tough, but I think there has been a stand. And again, remember, Ukraine is trying to get into the European Union. And what are the foundations of the European Union? The rule of law, human rights, democracy, and in some ways, Ukrainians are, or people, the leadership in Ukraine is kind of frustrated because you look at Poland and Hungary that are kind of regressing in all of this, and Ukraine is trying to move in that direction.
Okay, so not to get back into the West-centered view of things, but are there things that the US could have done to prevent this war from happening?
It would have been hard because the language used out of Moscow is revanchist. Listen, I really like this one historian, Stephen Kotkin, and he refers to Russia as a military police dictatorship. He was in the KGB. When the USSR collapsed, he said it was a great tragedy, but at another interview, he said, but that was foolishness, the socialism and communism. What's important is recreating the empire. And this determination to recreate some kind of mythical past and and play on it, has created a situation where I think many in the West thought you could reason with him, and in reality, it's a proto-fascist state. You look at all the repressions taking place now. You know, what a tragedy. You have these very talented young Russians are fleeing. Over 200,000 educated people are fleeing. Protests. You could be thrown in jail for 15 years.
Yeah.
These are young people. These are activists. And, you know, the foundation is the KGB. You know, there are some who say, oh, poor Putin, NATO. Well, those countries that did join NATO feel really good right now. And there was a reason why they joined NATO, whether it was Poland or the Baltic states. And some might say if in 2008, Ukraine and Georgia were part of NATO, we may never have had this invasion taking place. No. You know, I see these postings by people who kind of claim to be progressive, quoting Russia Today. That's a propaganda piece.
Yeah, Russia Today is a real problem. We are almost out of time. We have about a minute left. Is there anything you want to get in that you haven't already said?
Well, please do know that in Ukraine, you have a civic identity, a civic nationalism. You have people of very many different backgrounds. And if you've noticed, there are demonstrations, peaceful demonstrations in Kherson. The big fear now is they're seeking out elected officials in Kherson, bringing in people actually who were part of the former repressive regime. So there's peaceful resistance, but again, the country's really united. They don't not want to be part of an oligarchical police state. And that is what exists in Russia right now. In Belarus, you had massive demonstrations 2 years ago, and we saw what happened there. And what's interesting is the attempt to put in some kind of quisling puppet government. And
We're out of time. I have to thank you. You've given us a lot to think about. This has
I only got
been
started.
This has been DSA Presents. Been talking to Zenon Wasyliw. Thanks for watching.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.